Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll get right to it here, right? I think you're in for a treat. I think you'll love this. Our speaker has inspired audiences to work towards a brighter future at venues such as the World Bank, the United Nations General Assembly, and the Royal Society. In sharing her knowledge as AI faculty at Singularity University and author of Machine Intelligence courseware for O'Reilly Media, she realized the importance of protecting human rights and putting ethics, safety, and the values of the human spirit into AI. She serves as Senior Scientific Advisor to the Future Society, Senior Fellow to the Atlantic Council, and holds fellowships from the British Computing Society and Royal Statistical Society, among others. Today, we explore a bit of the dark side of artificial intelligence and what we can do. So let's have a royal welcome for Nell Watson.
Thank you all very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to join you, and good morning to all. Today, I'm going to look at some of the different aspects of artificial intelligence or machine intelligence that aren't always discussed. I'm a big believer in the power of machine intelligence. I think it is certainly transforming our personal and professional lives, and that's only going to continue into the future. There will be trade-offs. Some people will benefit more than others. But today I'd like to paint a picture of some of the potentially more troublesome aspects of that, and hopefully by the end also have a look at some of the ways in which we can help to mitigate that. So we're living in a world today where often our activities online might seem as if they're a little bit hijacked on some occasions. Perhaps we are checking out at an online e-commerce portal, maybe buying a flight, for example, and we find that we have been opted in by default to a magazine subscription at the same time. And some of these more egregiously naughty aspects are slowly being phased out by legislation. But lots of people are finding other tricky ways in which to fool us. For example, this appears to be 4 radio buttons. Those radio buttons are the ones you can only select one of, and you would assume it would work a little bit like this. But no, they are in fact disguised checkboxes. These are little tricks which online internet marketing people describe as dark patterns. They are patterns of behavioral influence which can encourage us to take certain actions which otherwise we may not. And these dark patterns are becoming an increasing issue in our lives and are becoming increasingly intelligent. We now live in a world where all kinds of content can be created on the fly, which looks perfectly believable, perfectly credible, and yet is invented by a machine. This kind of content can alter the appearance of reality to shift somebody's age or gender or even ethnicity. And this can be used for simple japes, playing pranks, but it can also, of course, be used to defraud people or to impersonate people in different ways. Today, we have technologies which can filter all kinds of different video content. You'll see this lady here is wearing very strange makeup. It's strange to the naked eye, but under the filters, it is amplified by machine eyes to make her look almost supernaturally beautiful. Sometimes this fails, and bloggers of a certain age have been revealed despite them using heavy filters to make themselves look different. Sometimes a glitch occurs and this can lead to significant embarrassment. We're now also living in a world where we can do this stuff on the fly to transpose one person's actions, such as their speech, pose, etc., onto a virtual person in a way which is seamless, immediate, and generally not so easy to spot. It used to be that it required the resources of a state actor to disappear people out of photographs or out of history. This disappeared gentleman is cosmonaut Gelyubov, who, for reasons that aren't quite clear, was disappeared from history and erased altogether. Today, of course, we can do this algorithmically. We can take things out of existence, whether in photographs or in moving media, and in essence, it's almost as if they never existed in the first place. And it's actually quite trivial to do this. There are tools today where you can select who you want to see disappear, and then blunk, off they go. It's very easy for these algorithmic rule-based technologies to alter reality, or in essence to solve for obfuscation, right? To find the ways in which it is an optimal way to proceed in order to blind people to reality or to manipulate them to do things that they otherwise wouldn't. Increasingly these days, we're seeing a lot of people being banned from online platforms or excluded, sometimes for very arbitrary reasons, even reasons which aren't transparent. People's accounts can be mysteriously disappeared. But generally speaking, at least one is aware that one's account has been deleted, right? One has some idea that something's gone wrong. But there are emerging forms of excluding people which are much more insidious. They're much more quiet and hidden. For example, deboosting means that people's content that they share has less access to other people. Essentially, their freedom of speech technically remains, but their freedom of reach has been curtailed. And because of that, freedom of speech itself becomes kind of meaningless. And how we connect with others is incredibly important because of this thing called informational gerrymandering. Just like in a political sphere, how you draw lines around groups can influence how those groups interact or who ends up having general control over those groups. Here, lots of people are talking to each other, as it should be, fairly normally. But perhaps we segment these groups so that the yellows are mostly talking to each other, and a couple of the yellows have been looped in with the purples. Over time, those two yellows will come to believe as if they are in the minority opinion, and all things being equal, they will tend to alter their opinions or their values over time, despite not actually being a minority. We're also starting to see alterations in how people interact with their own devices. You might be meeting up with a friend, perhaps for some sort of a protest, and you get those very important double check marks in WhatsApp to tell you, yes, this message has been received. But on their device, nothing. They never received it at all. This is something called on-device content moderation, where your very own device is programmed to lie to you. And you can play tourist and switch the country settings on your device and watch how it changes. Watch how you can suddenly access things you couldn't before, or maybe certain things disappear in strange ways. Now there are forums on Reddit which are entirely populated by bots. So none of these posters are real. None of these topics are real. They've all been trained on existing Reddit content. But what if, for example, somebody was placed into a virtual forum like that? They thought they were talking with their peers, but in fact, they had been placed into an invisible glass box that they could look out of, but didn't realize that they were locked inside. And if this seems far-fetched, well, many of the social media companies, which increasingly control our destiny these days, have taken out patents on these kinds of concepts. Our online world is often increasingly socially dangerous to our reputation, sometimes dangerous to our sanity as well. It often is advisable to be careful who you're sharing things with and try not to be too controversial. But even today, if you behave yourself, there's still a potential for opinion necromancy. That's this practice where people look back into the past in order to pluck some statement which might have been perfectly fine 20 years ago, but now today is considered problematic. And the internet and the World Wide Web have now been around for quite some time. The web is almost 30 years old. And for a lot of that, people were conversing on forums and things with handles, right? With call signs, as it were, and not using their real name. And they thought that they were perfectly anonymized for doing that. But that might be about to change. There's new techniques now, which using the power of machine learning can analyze things like text in order to pick up a linguistic signature. And this is how the author J.K. Rowling, who wanted to moonlight in a different genre, right, to go into detective novels rather than youth fantasy. And she was recognized due to these kinds of linguistic signatures. But these signatures are found not only in how we write, but also in how we move. Our gait, for example, can be picked up. Or similarly now, there are algorithms which can act kind of like a microscope for time to amplify tiny movements in the face, and from that, understand every single heartbeat as the blood passes through the face and then passes the other way. And from that, we can work out people's heart rate. And it's fun to do this with videos of politicians when they get asked a very difficult question and you see the heart rate go way up. And yes, this functions just with standard video, like you might watch on TV or a movie. But also these kinds of algorithms can figure out when we have an emotional frisson to something, right? What kind of stimulus gives a certain response? What intrigues us or what disturbs us? And these kinds of linguistic techniques are enabling some of the larger tech companies now to create kind of a virtual voodoo doll where they can poke this thing and predict how we're going to act if they give us a certain stimulus, right? If they share something to us which is particularly funny or particularly sad from one of our friends, for example, how that might affect our behavior or how that might be used to influence us to purchase something. There's another intriguing and somewhat unsettling idea called false feedback. And it's the idea that you ask someone their opinion and then you give that opinion back to them in a different form So for example, I might ask you, what's your favorite dinner? And you might say lasagna. And I say, oh, very interesting. And then I come back the next day and I say, I remember you telling me that your favorite meal was spaghetti bolognese. And you might scratch your head for a moment. But statistically, you're likely to accept my assertion about your favorite meal and to actually potentially update your own preferences accordingly. This is basically an exploit in the human brain, a little bit like, you know, various illusionists use and various optical illusions function. These kinds of illusions of the mind can be used to manipulate people in all kinds of ways. And you might say, oh, no, I'm pretty sure I did say lasagna. But that can be explained away. It's just a glitch, right? Oops, yeah, something went wrong with the system. We don't know why. But was it a glitch? Was it a problem with some algorithm? Or perhaps the ghost of something all too human buried within that machine, pulling its strings from behind the scenes? Who can say? It may feel soon as if we are stalked by some kind of cyber poltergeist that manipulates the world in strange ways that we struggle to understand and that we feel is difficult to escape. And it is an ancient observation that those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. And I wonder, therefore, how might those with godlike powers in our society be disposed to treat us if we displease them? Well, we're starting to find out. A series of eBay executives were that just activated my my onboard AI by accident by hearing that word. A selection, shall we say, therefore, of eBay executives were busted in targeting bloggers who were skeptical and critical about eBay's policies. And these eBay executives now admit that there was a campaign of harassment against this couple, where they sent things like live insects to the house, and they sent pornography to the neighbors in the gentleman's name, etc. And this went on for a very long time, which is rather disturbing that this is coming from within a company. Other companies like Amazon have elevated to their board persons like General Alexander, who was significant in the very illegal wiretapping, domestic wiretapping programs that we saw over the past 10 years or so. And now companies like Amazon have hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of contracts with organizations such as the CIA. Amazon is, of course, not only a company that we depend on for our shopping increasingly, but also that has literally millions of these Alexa-enabled devices in all kinds of kitchens and living rooms and cars and smart devices. And these are listening to us. They're listening to our conversations, and those conversations are increasingly being subpoenaed and used by law enforcement as evidence against people, against their activities. Moreover, there are eyes in the sky, an increasing number, shining down upon us. And the rate of satellites going into orbit is now exponential. It was just 1,000 or so until recently, and now it's somewhere about 4,000 satellites. And very soon it will be in the tens of thousands. And these satellites now, because access to space has become so cheap, and because the resolution of cameras is so sophisticated, especially when paired with machine learning, these systems can track us with tremendous accuracy and pinpoint exactly where we go. And yes, these are commercial organizations which are collecting this kind of data, but that data then passes on to other hands further and further down the line. And very often that ends up in the hands of intelligence agencies, both foreign and domestic. Today, there are now even satellite-based imaging technologies that can look inside buildings, that can see what's going on inside brick, concrete, wood, and steel. There's very little ability to truly hide anymore. Even tiny little, very low resolution images can be restored. You can take a very lo-fi input and reconstruct what that original image must have looked like. And this means that even modest imaging hardware can now artificially become so much more capable. And we can do this for faces, yes, to recognize people from very grainy footage. Or we can also do it for other things like text. A very, very low resolution over-the-shoulder snooping of something can now be restored back to completely legible text. And all of these algorithms are available off the shelf and can be run simply on anyone's desktop computer. So where does this leave us? We're now living in a world where very powerful machine intelligences can write essays, like is shown on this screen. Essays which are actually surprisingly detailed and surprisingly smart. These technologies are able to predict the appropriate dosage of medicine, or to solve high school algebra problems, or to translate from Swahili into Chinese, but not just text, but also poetry, and keeping both the meaning and the meter of that poem. In a world where this kind of content can be understood or generated with so much ease, there remains a disturbing proposition for how it could be deployed. In East Germany, the secret police, the Stasi, had a very particular tactic that they invented. And in German, they called it Zersetzung, which means biodegradation or decomposition, you could say. Now, most authoritarian regimes, when they have dissidents, they usually deal with them by accosting them in an alleyway and beating them up. But not the Stasi. They were far more subtle. In fact, the dissidents that they targeted generally had no idea that they were being targeted at all. Agents would break into people's houses and change the settings on their alarm clock, or alter the socks in their drawer from brown to purple, or offer them a fantastic new line of work that's exactly what they might be dreaming of, and then at the last minute snatch it away and say, oh no, you're not appropriate for this at all. They would set people against each other, husband against wife, children against parents, brother against sister. They would invent stories, and they would damage people's personal and professional reputations. They would gaslight people, essentially, so that they stopped being able to believe in reality anymore. And they became incredibly paranoid, but they didn't understand why they should be paranoid. All they knew was their lives were falling apart, and they no longer had the energy or inclination to be dissidents any longer. And I'm sorry to say that this tactic was incredibly effective. And in a world where machine intelligence is so sophisticated, and where surveillance is so ubiquitous and omnipresent, authoritarian regimes could use these kinds of techniques in an automated fashion to target and harass all kinds of different people all over the world. For me, this is the most terrifying aspect of these technologies. Technologies which I still believe have tremendous potential for doing good in the world and will do good if we figure out how to mitigate the worst and scariest possibilities. Our minds must not become a battleground for someone else's war, because it does seem as if demoralization of individuals and even societies has become a new theater of war. We must preserve the mind. It must be sacrosanct. It must fall under a new Geneva Convention or two. And one of the best ways that we can defend ourselves is to ensure transparency. Sunlight, as they say, is the best disinfectant. And it is a prerequisite for good ethics, because you need to know what's going on in order to figure out who is accountable, or how things like privacy or bias might be part of the picture. I'm pleased that new privacy laws are coming out. This is an example of the things that the Facebook app collects about you on iOS, which is a very, very, very long list indeed. And now finally, we're able to learn about this stuff, whether it's through new regulations or whether it's through companies deciding to be a little bit more responsible. I myself have done a lot of work with my teams at the IEEE, helping to create certifications for more transparent systems, as well as the transparency of the organizations behind them, those organizations who are responsible for deploying these technologies. We've begun to employ these ideas in things like contact tracing to make those contact tracing technologies on our phones a little bit more secure, because we can better understand what's going on and when. I think that if we can boil down our principles into actionable standards and certifications, we can preserve our freedom and indeed grow it by enjoying the fruits of what these technologies can bring us, whilst securing away some of the worst possibilities at the same time. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments.
Thank you, Nell. We'll take questions if that's okay.
Of course.
Jim Margraf, you're up.
Great, Nell. Thanks so much for your presentation. Spot on, superb. I work in technology and AI, and am associated with the Center for Human Compatible AI. A colleague of mine,
Oh, great.
director at Berkeley, you may know, Mark Nitzberg, and that's where Stuart Russell is as well. So
Yes.
some great people there. Two questions. One
Of
is, you may
course.
have heard at the beginning that we're working on creating a repository to be able to take presentations and share them with 1.25 million Rotarians globally. I think your presentation today is a wonderful candidate. So we'd love to see if we might be able to do that and work out the rights for life, just to be able to share that. So
Thank
we
you
can come back
kindly.
to
I'd
that.
be delighted.
Fantastic. The second question is on behalf of Rotarians. You may know there's an ethos that Rotary has, which is called a four-way test. And it's a four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. And it asks the question, is it of something? In that regard, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Does it build goodwill and better friendships? And is it beneficial to all concerned? Looking at it as a speaker to 1.25 million Rotarians, what would you like to see Rotarians do to address the issues that you have proposed?
That's a very,
Sorry.
that is a very, very good question. I must say, I find that ethos so beautiful and so important, especially in today's world, especially in today's online world, where it's so easy to fire off the snarky, sneering comment, and you get a moment of schadenfreude, but really at the end of the day,
That's possibly a relationship or friendship that's been scuppered, or somebody else has had a bad day because of that, you know? And I have a couple of little projects that some people might find of interest along those lines, because I'm a big believer in those values too. I have a little project at culturalpeace.org. That's www.culturalpeace.org, where I have some suggested principles for how we could create something like a Geneva Conventions for the culture war, essentially helping people to communicate in ways which are kinder and to contain conflict. You see, I have a bit of a funny accent, you might notice. I grew up in Northern Ireland, over in the United Kingdom, and that was a place of tremendous conflict, a very bloody civil conflict, almost a cold civil war, you could say, which went on for a very long time, decades, in fact. And I grew up with bombings and shootings and things like that as a daily occurrence. But then around 1998, something changed. We created some decent rules for how to manage conflict. And they were pretty simple, really. It was some things like not being able to discriminate based on housing or employment or education, based upon somebody's perceived political affiliation. And along with some other reforms within policing, for example, to make it a little bit more representative, 80% of the conflict evaporated almost overnight. And Northern Ireland today is a very, very different place than it used to be. Today, children don't have to suffer the same as I myself did. And I really found that lesson very inspirational, because if we can set those basic ground rules in order to keep conflict contained so that it's a war of words and doesn't metastasize into other areas, well, then maybe we can help to keep the wheels in our society better. Maybe we can help people to work together and to invest in a sustainable future that works for all of us. I have another little project as well at ethicsnet.org, where I am working to crowdsource examples of pro-social, that is friendly, welcome, preferable behavior from all around the world. Because I don't want to just have one set of values loaded into AI, right? Whether it's the values of Silicon Valley or the values of Shanghai or anywhere else. I think that if AI is to work for the world, it needs to reflect the world, and it needs to be able to understand us. It's a very important aspect of being a friendly person to understand the preferences of others and to try to meet those, right? That's part of being charming and a welcoming presence. And if we are to teach AI those kinds of preferences, we need to have examples. And that's what the project is all about, trying to set a good role model for AI for many different cultures and situations all around the world, so that AI can meet us where we ever happen to be.
I have a question for you, Nell. Listening to the spaghetti lasagna information causes me to think, and without being too political, that there may be a former member of our government who's no longer in the White House who knows a little bit about what you've been talking about, which scares the heck out of me. Is there any reason to believe that anyone in that administration was using the type of misinformation on an AI basis?
I don't really know. I can't really speak to that. It does seem as if certain kinds of targeted harassment have occurred for diplomats who may have been targeted by non-state actors or by foreign governments. However, I am not aware of examples of targeting of civilians, as it were, or the common member of the public. But, you know, these technologies amplify our capabilities in so many ways. That's a definite possibility. And I fear that by the middle of this new decade, that might become increasingly common. So not just providing individualized propaganda so much as actually individualized behavioral modification techniques or behavioral causing people to doubt reality, essentially, what's sometimes described as gaslighting. Any other thoughts or questions or comments?
Well, Nell, I remember hearing a long time ago people saying, don't believe everything you read, because there's just a whole lot of falsehood, garbage, whatever you want to call it out there. Now it's beginning to seem like you can't believe everything you see, or even what you think are genuine photographs or videos of real people in action. Don't believe it. So it kind of leaves us without any mooring for reality.
Absolutely. It's what in philosophical terms you might describe as an epistemic crisis. You know, how do you know what you know?
Exactly my word for it. Yes.
Yes. And I think this also contributes as well to a lot of polarization, a lot of things like identity politics. When people feel as if they cannot adequately understand the world, and they cannot easily understand how things are operating in the world, they tend to retreat back into what is familiar, right? Their own homies that they've grown up with and around, and their own culture, their own way of doing things. And that tends to make people a little more insular, and it tends to weaken social trust, particularly between groups and societies, not just between individuals. And as I mentioned briefly, I really do think that kind of demoralization is really a new theater of war. It's war is no longer being fought by tanks and drones. It's about how much you can get into civilians' heads.
Nell, it seems like we need regulations, although our country shies away from that because of our holding firm to freedom. And yet there is that problem of, if the other guy is doing it, I've got to do it more, to just in self-defense. How do you get regulations that can be enforced worldwide?
You raise a very important point. We are in kind of an arms race with these technologies, particularly since last summer. Last summer was when a very powerful new AI technique called GPT-3 came around. Some of you might have heard of it. It basically supersizes the amount of computing power which is devoted to training these algorithms. So they basically eat all of the text on the internet and try to make sense of that. And before last summer, nobody really understood that investing $10 or $20 million in training an AI would pay off. But now we know that it does. And in fact, maybe investing 100 million may pay off an even greater proportion. And so this has set off an arms race. Now, big tech companies, non-state actors, intelligence agencies are dumping money into creating these massive AI models, which are very difficult to understand how they function. And that is creating an arms race. And alongside it, as you say, indeed, Perhaps instead of a missile gap, it's a moralization gap or demoralization gap, right? And so you've got to demoralize the other guy and keep your own people chipper, right? Like keep them believing in the values of society, right? Keep them believing in our most important and cherished traditions, which bind us together as a society. And so, you know, some of this work may be offensive, but some of it may be defensive as well. We want to make sure that this stuff is done as safely and as appropriately as possible, with as much responsibility and transparency as possible. And there are a lot of principles out there. Different organizations have come up with principles of how technology should be used, which is a great start. Principles are important because they're timeless. The Peelian policing principles of Sir Robert Peel are almost 200 years old, but they're no less valuable. They say that policing should be done with the consent and the cooperation of the public. That's a beautiful value. And even though forensics and policing has changed massively in 200 years, that principle remains. All I was saying really is that it's very important that we boil down principles into something actionable, something that we can take action upon and benchmark how well an organization or a system is meeting the mark or not. And so that's been a lot of my work the last few years with the IEEE, which is an international organization for creating standards in technology, particularly electronics technologies. And now we've been doing a lot of work in ethics as well. So creating standards and certifications for what systems should be able to provide on demand or to report on demand, to better understand what systems are doing, for what purposes, and to whose benefit.
Hey, Nell, this is Dan Herbert. Thanks very much for your presentation. I really liked it a lot.
Thank you.
5 or 6 years ago, I guess we had Cambridge Analytica doing some of this stuff. And I know that they ceased operations rather quickly. But I have a sense that what they did and the technology that they used continues somehow, some way, in some places. So I hope that some of these ethical standards that you're bringing forward, I know GDPR is helping, but it's just really kind of scratching the surface. Was Cambridge Analytica doing this kind of thing 6 years ago, 6 years ago?
To a significant degree, yes, in terms of pinpointing when exactly to influence someone with particular content, yes. And now, actually, funnily, a lot of this work appears to be done in places like Kosovo. Kosovo is now the ground zero rather, of these kinds of influence campaigns, as well as various hacking of different pages and things to almost seamlessly change the content. So the owner of the page changes, the content changes slightly, and people don't actually notice, but they're now getting a slightly different flavor of content, which looks superficially like the old stuff, but that changes people's perspectives over time.
We can only hope that people use this incredible skills and new programming for good going forward. So thanks for doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you all for wanting to make a difference and for listening. Thank you.
As a grandfather, could I ask, what do you tell your grandchildren about how to be preparing to think in these new terms?
That's a very great question. I suppose trust but verify. Always try and seek out further information to ascertain if something is true or not, as far as you can tell, and always be prepared for something that seemed very real to perhaps not be.
Yeah.
Well, I'll let you all go. And I just want to say thank you
you.
very much indeed for inviting me. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.